Welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Steven Roy Goodman. I'm here at Liliesleaf in Johannesburg, South Africa, where we're going to be talking with singer-songwriter Laurie Levine. Laurie's music is known throughout South Africa and around the world as kind of soulful and has an American element to it as well, which hopefully we'll get into today. So welcome, Laurie.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, thank you for coming on. And as I just alluded to a second ago, Laurie, you're South African, but your music in some ways sounds a little American as well.
I've been quite influenced by American music, particularly in the genre of Americana music, which is sort of alt, country, rock, folk music. It's a large umbrella for all those different genres. So over the last few years, my music's definitely kind of swayed in that direction, and that's why you're hearing those influences.
But where do they come from if you grew up in Johannesburg?
Well, the music I've bought, the music I've listened to and been exposed to. A couple years ago, I was in New York City and I saw the great Emmylou Harris. And she really inspired me to start writing country and folk music, which I've been delving into for the last few years.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and if we could get into your background a little bit, one of the things that intrigued me about your background, even before we met, was it seemed to me that you were a humanities person. It seemed to me that there was something in your background, in your educational background, that had to do with the humanities. Was I dreaming that?
No, I studied a BA Dramatic Art at Wits. So, yeah, my background's definitely humanities-based. I also studied English literature at university. So all of this certainly shaped the way my music's come out.
Well, can we delve into that a little bit? How do you think the humanities, and particularly the courses you took in drama, really did specifically influence your music?
Well, let's start with my high school education, which was also the humanities. I absolutely always had a passion for English as a subject. And, through the writing of essays, I learned about self-expression and the study of poetry. That seeped into my work. And then I did drama as one of my courses at school, and had this fantastic drama teacher who was just very passionate about the world and about the arts, and she had a big influence on me, and she opened me up creatively. And we had to kind of do a lot of character studies, so studying the internal worlds of different characters and the motivations behind people's actions. And then going on to university, I studied acting, and obviously there you kind of literally walking in other people's shoes for a short while and learning about different people's perspectives and outlooks on life. And English literature was my great love and still is. And I read so many wonderful writers during that time. I did my thesis on Toni Morrison's novel Sula. And I think all of that kind of influences the way one expresses oneself.
Well, that's an interesting point that you make, particularly about walking in other people's shoes.
Yes.
How did you make the transition from kind of walking in other people's shoes then, and studying other people's shoes, as it were, to essentially expressing your own shoes? Because when I think about your music, I think about you really sharing some pretty intimate things about your personal life through your music.
Yeah, I mean, I think songwriting's always been a pretty natural skill for me. I picked up the guitar, I don't know, I must have been about 13, and I took up guitar lessons, and the writing just followed. So I don't think I kind of intellectually figured out how to make that happen with my own music. It just kind of happened naturally somehow. But I think through learning those skills, I was able to translate that into song, and somehow many albums later, I'm still writing.
Which is great. Now, you've done 5 or 6 albums by now, haven't you?
I'm busy working on my 7th at the moment.
Wow. That's a lot of albums.
That's a lot of albums, yeah.
So now how does it work? Can you walk us through, so how does it work to create an album, if you don't mind sharing the secret sauce?
Well, it's interesting you ask me that right now because I'm going through the motions. It's quite a long, drawn-out process. Firstly, you write the songs. Well, people have different ways of making an album, so I'll just speak about my way, which is one of many. I generally go to the studio with the songs prepared, and then you kind of have to figure out what sound you want, what you're going for. So with this new album of mine, it's a totally different sound to what I've done in the past, which has been really based in country and folk. I'm kind of stepping out of that for a little while to create something that is firstly more electric guitar driven. So once you've got your palette, you're kind of going, this is the range of instruments I'm using. Do I want beats? Do I want drums? And then you'll call in musicians to fill those roles and to create those textures to work with the palette that you're working with. And I usually start by recording demos or guide tracks. And that's kind of the skeleton. And then you build up the song around that and you add different parts. And then you'll re-record the guitars, you'll re-record the vocals usually, or sometimes you do get the good bass first vocal take the first time you sing it. And then you just build it, like building a building. You're adding all these bricks on until eventually it's complete.
And well, what happens if you want to change it along the way?
That happens all the time. Then you rethink it. I mean, for this album, I started with 14 tracks, then I whittled it down to 12. Now I've whittled it down to 11. Now I'm thinking of reintroducing one of the others. Then you rework songs, and then you kind of go back to the basics. You strip everything away. You press mute on all the things you've recorded, except your guitar, perhaps. Or you go, let's try this on piano and voice and see what happens. So, for example, I had a song that was quite bluesy, quite fast tempo, and I didn't feel it was fitting in with the album. So I stripped everything down and I said, can we try single strums on the guitar and really simplify it? And I'm really enjoying that. So it's never too late to rework something.
But what about somebody who gives you some input besides you? So in that case, you just stripped it down because it sounded good to your ears.
Right.
Do you ever bring in some colleagues who say, well, Laurie, I think you may want to try X, Y, Z?
I think it's really important to have other people's ears, because what happens is you get ear lethargy, which is inevitable. You kind of listening to the same songs day in, day out, and you lose perspective. You get a bit lost in the woods. So yeah, I do get a lot of people's input where I can, and if their suggestions resonate with me, then I'll go with it. I'm generally quite gung-ho with my intuition about where a song should be, but outside perspective is definitely helpful.
Now, what would you like somebody, and hopefully you don't mind these questions, but what would you like a listener to do after they listen to your music? Do you want them to vote for somebody? Do you want them to kiss their boyfriend or girlfriend? Do you want them to reflect on something? What do you want them to do?
My music's quite personal, and my aim with my music is to make people feel. That's my job, to move them in some way. So if people can leave the listening experience of my music feeling more naked and exposed in a positive way, in like a touching sides with their own soul and their own heart, then I feel like my job is done. And, you know, hopefully inspire people to find their own creativity. But I wouldn't say my music would necessarily move someone to do something political. It's more on a personal level what I do.
That's interesting, because I do hear it as a personal, when I hear your music, I hear personal stories through your music.
Yes.
But you want me as the listener to be more in touch with myself.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think music is really about also finding some kind of connection, because we all experience being human, and it's a really lonely, alienating world and chaotic world. And if you can have a moment of connecting with some kind of universal truth, then that's a beautiful thing. And that's where the arts are really wonderful.
Well, that's a great point. And in fact, about the connection. So can we talk a little bit about the literature that inspired you when you were a kid? So how did you connect with that literature? And where was that connection, and where is that connection now? And if you could draw that to your music somehow.
So, well, for starters, my dad was, through the years, and still is, a very avid book collector. So I had this house with shelves of books, surrounded by books. And then I started reading literature in my teens. I read some of the great novels of our time that really, just made me feel more in touch with the world and what was going on in the world. And some of those works definitely were formative in, who I became as a person and as a songwriter. People like Gabrielle Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, John Race White's Sargasso Sea. I'm trying to think. I loved William Faulkner, The Sound and the Fury. There were just some very, big moments for me where I kind of understood myself in the world a bit more. So literature was, and it's such a beautiful thing to just step into another world and be taken somewhere for a little while.
Absolutely. And what about music? What music did you listen to when you were younger and as your career progressed?
Some of the greats like Bruce Springsteen, Leonard Cohen, Gillian Welsh. I think a lot of Ryan Adams, there's so many in that American tradition had a strong influence on me. And before then, I loved Bob Dylan, Van Morrison when I was a bit younger. And it's continually changing. Music definitely seeps into the way that you write your own songs. So yeah, many influences over the years.
Well, if we can get also back to future kids, or kids who are now kids and who will be adults soon.
Right.
What message would you like to give to them? Let's say they're in school now, let's say they're watching this discussion, and their parents are saying, well, honey, you really need to get a job. This is great, but how is this going to help you get a job?
Well, I've been listening to the autobiography, the audiobook autobiography of Bruce Springsteen. And he was one of those kids. And he came from a very poverty-stricken family. And he pushed and he pushed. And he blocked those voices out. And I really think that in today's world, you have to block out those critical voices. If you really are passionate about doing something and you feel you can, make some kind of mark doing it, then you have to do it. You have to do what you have to do. My parents have been supportive, but I'm sure they would have preferred if I'd become a doctor or a lawyer. And I've had these societal voices, imagined or real, in my head that keep coming in. And I've made a career out of it. So I think, kids should really stick to their guns. I think teachers really need to read kids. I think that's the role of a teacher, is to be incredibly open to what a kid is bringing to the learning. And teachers can learn from kids as well. I think it's a two-way communication. And I think it's in that flexibility that growth is happens. And some of my most influential teachers were people who understood the pressures of the educational environment. So they're not going to say, run with whatever you want to run with. But they had a flexibility and a warmth and a way of kind of making a child feel at ease. And I think that's when you get the best results from kids.
And would you say the same thing about the university level as well?
Certainly. Being able to encourage kids. I think it's all about encouragement. There's a sternness sometimes to educators, a very kind of stiff sternness that doesn't... kids are intimidated by adult figures often. So I think that would apply, to university teaching as well.
What about the teaching of music? So in the United States, one can get a degree, a bachelor's of music, but one can also get a Bachelor of Arts and study some music along the way.
Right.
But my understanding is that some people argue that that can hurt creativity. Other people argue that it's great for the specifics. Yes.
I think it can only expand your knowledge. I love the pairing of different disciplines. I think it's great.
And so for instance, would you find somebody in school, like when you were in school, did you have any pairings with anybody who studied very different areas, let's say chemistry or something like that, who
Yes.
somehow influenced you?
Right. Yeah, I had a lot of, at WITS you have the East Campus and the West Campus, and I had friends who were studying law, and it was kind of a journey. You had to walk quite a long distance to get there, and it was also a different kind of journey into a different world, because they are such opposing worlds in a sense. But it was wonderful to kind of have the two play off each other and understand that this world exists, but so does this world, and I think there's certainly places of confluence.
And you've collaborated before with other musicians, but sometimes and often you're by yourself.
Yes.
Could you speak to the difference between what it's like to collaborate on a musical venture versus doing it on your own?
It's a very, very different experience. So I've had the fortune to work with another songwriter, Josie Field. We kind of emerged on the music scene around the same time in 2005, and we were on similar stages and lineups. And eventually we decided to do this full-on collaboration project called Tiger Lily. And it was incredibly special, being able to step back in a sense, because if you're performing solo, you're in the front all the time and you're taking charge all the time. Whereas if you have a collaborator, it's a joint venture and you're kind of both standing somewhere in the middle, and it's a give and take thing, you can't have full range of expression, but then you find a different path of expression which is equally as important and powerful and beautiful. It's less lonely working in a collaboration, but the solo thing's also wonderful because you just can do whatever you want. There's no rules. There's no one to answer to. So it's a very different dynamic, You really choose the direction you're going in and you have full control of that.
I've always been intrigued by musicians who are expressing themselves, and you're putting yourself out there, right? And you're sharing personal things about your life.
Yes.
And then somebody's in the audience, or somebody listens to your music, or they watch your music video. And so it seems to me it's kind of an interesting thing, because what do you want the result to be?
I think the best that you can do as an artist is be at peace with what you're putting out, be comfortable with what you're putting out, and entirely okay to go, this is what I'm putting out there. When it comes to live performance, that's an in-the-moment thing. So you can't really control, well, you can control the outcome, but, there's the audience, there's your mood on the day, there's so many different factors. There's your band members, but all you have to do is be in the moment and give of yourself. That's all you can do, and whatever happens after that is what's going to happen.
And speaking of giving of yourself, you did a book, it might have been about 10 years ago now, about, I think it was about traditional music of South Africa, if I have that correct.
Yes, that's correct.
Can you say a little bit about that book and what that meant to you?
Yeah, I was working at a company called the Drum Cafe, and I started researching. We saw that there was a big gap in research on traditional South African music. Or not perhaps that there was a gap, more that no one had written a comprehensive outline of this research. And so somehow it came to be that I put together the research, I compiled research, I went to Grahamstown to the International Library of African Music and went through the archives and put together this book. And it was really interesting. I learned so much about the traditional music and culture in South Africa and how it's dying and where it is surviving and all of that.
Do you think the music is dying?
You know, we have a range of traditional instruments that are no longer played or no longer made. They were very much thriving in the rural areas. And as you know, with urbanization, these instruments slowly, and westernization, these instruments slowly started disappearing. So arguably, it is on the decline.
Well, we only have a few minutes left. So is there anything that you'd like to say to an American audience who may be meeting you for the first time right now?
Well, this program has an educational slant. So I think just to emphasize again what I was saying, which is, you know, for children who have a certain talent, not necessarily in music, but in the arts, in fields that are not deemed by society at large as kind of viable and not as paths to wealth and, you know. I think the arts are really essential in society, and there are many people who have influenced society on such a strong, you know, in an undercurrent, more in an undercurrent kind of way. You can just feel the influence and the way that it shapes people's experience of being in the world and connecting with other people. And so to all the kids out there who are in doubt about this, kind of just pursue what your heart's calling is.
And it's interesting you say that, because I think we should mention another thing about where we are physically. We're in a place called Liliesleaf, which is where many of the members of the African National Congress were captured and then went on trial to what became known as the Rivonia trials.
Right.
And that was a historic moment in South Africa. But the other point that I thought would be relevant from what you just said is, if I'm not mistaken, there was a documentary done a number of years ago called Amandla, A Revolution in Four-Part Harmony.
Yes.
I might be butchering the name, but it chronicled the influence of musicians on the anti-apartheid struggle.
Yes. I mean, musicians had a huge voice in the anti-apartheid struggle, and in fact, some of our most interesting music came out through that time. Lady Smith Black Mambazo, who you interviewed, Miriam Makeba, Hugh Masekela. There were so many of our greats, our iconic figures, who were born out of this great pain in this country and really revolutionized society and culture. And so, yeah, it is wonderful to be here.
So if you think about those historic great musicians, I mean, South African history might have been quite different had Hugh Masekela decided not to play any instruments.
Yes.
Or had Miriam Makeba decided not to be a singer and to do something else. I mean, in some ways, they really changed history.
Yeah, they really changed the course of history, and they can really be felt in our history, you know, as these revolutionary figures who really created change through expression, through things that were said that couldn't be said otherwise. The arts created a medium through which such things could be said and made tangible.
Well, and actually one could say that about a play as well. If you think about a play, it's one thing to say torture is bad. It's another thing to demonstrate that on stage.
All the arts, indeed. I mean, South Africa had a very strong theatre, a thriving theatre culture during those years and afterwards. So I think, and dance, all the arts have been incredible in contributing towards our history and our legacy.
Well, let's get back to your legacy, and then I think we're going to have to say goodbye. So in terms of your legacy of music, can you walk us through some of your albums that you've done so far? And I know you're in the middle of one, so I'm not going to put you on the spot and say, what's the new one going to be about exactly, because you're in the middle of creating it. But can you walk us through the ones that you've done? And I think that would be a really nice way to say goodbye to our viewers today.
Great. So Unspoken was my first album, and it was just me trying to find a voice. The second album was called Living Room, and I was sort of listening to a bit of jazz and folk at the time, so those influences came through. I loved some of the jazz standards, and that really influenced the way I wrote at the time. Six Winters was kind of my big blue album. Most artists has one of those. That marked quite a difficult time in my life, very personal songs, and it's where I really fell in love with country and folk music. After that, I worked on an album called Border Crossing, where I kind of flirted with genres of soul and rock a bit more, had horn sections in there, so it was a bigger production. And then I worked with Josie Field on 2 albums, the latest of which is Tiger Lily, and that was very close harmonies, quite a typical country folk album. And now my new album, which is called Canyons, which I can speak about briefly, is inspired by nature largely. And it's gone off in a whole different direction, which I'm both terrified and very excited about.
Well, I'm not terrified, but I'm excited. So, Laurie, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. If you would like additional information about Laurie Levine, please visit laurielevine.co.za. If you would like to send a message to our viewer mailbox, please do so at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.